Podcasting Q&A for November 20th, 2017. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity to Podcast.com. Several questions lined up about the fastest way to grow your podcast listener base, how to connect a smartphone with a microphone so you can record phone calls and be able to hear, suggestions for guest management and how to stay consistent, a question about SoundCloud and embed pages on your own website, even if you use a actual podcast media host, question about how podcasters are monetizing or not monetizing, and a question about Spotify, plus any questions you may be asking while I'm hosting this live Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. If you're in the chat room right now and you have a question about podcasting, feel free to post it there. Or if you're watching the replay of this and you want your question asked in a future version or future Q&A, then please contact me through the website at theaudacitytopodcast.com/contact and join me live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern. So the first question is from Jake Joplin, who asked, what's the fastest way to grow my listener base and downloads after being 7 episodes into my weekly podcast? And he said that he started with 550 total downloads so far at this point, and he started with 3 episodes and released 1 per week thereafter from the beginning of the month. So the fastest way I know to grow your audience is to get in front of your ideal audience who already subscribes to podcasts. So the best way to do that is to be a guest or get mentioned on someone else's podcast who already has your ideal audience. I saw the biggest growth for the Audacity to Podcast was when I was on Cliff Ravenscraft's old podcast about podcasting called Podcast Answer Man, back in when he did a podcast about podcasting. And when I was a guest on his show, that's the biggest spike I've ever seen. Now, the amount of audience or listeners I have now compared to the result of that spike is higher now as the show has organically grown over time. But for the biggest spike I ever had, or maybe even the only spike, was back then when I was a guest on his show, because his podcast back then was a podcast about podcasting. His audience was already my ideal audience. And we had a conversation. I was providing value so his audience could hear me. And many of his audience already knew of me or had heard me or heard some feedback from me, saw me in some chat rooms, forums, and that kind of thing. So then when they hear the value that I brought, that made me more interesting to them and thus compelled them to subscribe, which many of them did back then. So if you can, be a guest on someone else's podcast, and not just any podcast, but it needs to be a podcast that has your ideal audience. I was a guest on John Lee Dumas's Entrepreneur on Fire podcast back in episode 549 of his show. I didn't see a spike resulting from that. And he has a really big audience. So here I got on really big show. Hardly anyone came over because of it. But if I'm a guest on someone else's podcast about podcasting, a lot more people will come over. Or if I'm providing much more relevant and unique value, this kind of thing comes from relationships. You have to have a relationship with that other podcaster so that when you say, hey, I've got some value to bring to your audience, could I be a guest on your show? They'll most likely say yes. For example, Jessica Rhodes, who has a company, and you might want to hire this company if you're thinking about being a guest. If you go over to interviewconnections.com, you can check out the services they offer. I have no affiliate relationship with them, but they are good friends. And I don't get paid if you use them. Now, if you want to hire interviewvalet.com, I do have an affiliate link for them if you're interested. But anyway, Jessica Rhodes has a podcast that is about podcasting. It's called Interview Connections or Rock the Mic. It's gone through many different branding iterations. But her podcast is basically a podcast about podcasting. And because her business is helping podcasters book and get booked, her podcast then focuses a lot on interviews. So because of the relationship I already have with Jessica Rhodes and her team, when I recently emailed her to say, hey, here's some value that I think I could provide to your audience. I'd love to be a guest on your podcast, if I may, to share this value that is tailored to your audience and answers these questions your audience might be asking. And if you're wondering what that is, it's about SEO value when you have guests on your podcast. Some more questions about that. So because we already had a relationship and because I was offering unique and relevant value, her response back was, yes, we'd love to have you on the podcast. That's because of that connection we already had. If she didn't know me and I was just out of the blue saying, hey, I'd like to be a guest on your podcast, I could talk about this and this, then there'd have to be a vetting process. She'd have to say, well, have you actually listened to our podcast? Do you know what we talk about? Do you know the purpose of our podcast? Do you know what our audience is like? Do you know these things about our podcast? Can you provide value to them? But because we had a relationship, I could just easily say, hey, here's some value. You want it? She said, yeah, I want it. And I'll be a guest on her podcast later in 2017, or it might publish actually in 2018. So get in front of the other podcast audience that's the ideal audience for you. It could also come from good relationships, just from mere mentions. When Dave Jackson talks about me, or I talk about Dave Jackson, or we're both talking about Podcasters Roundtable, we're doing that because of the relationship that's there, not because we're paid. We're not being paid to promote each other. We might not have each other as guests on shows, but we reference each other because of the relationship, because of the value we add to the space. So if you have a podcast already and you know what your ideal audience is, then you can look for other podcasts that have that same ideal audience and build relationships in those communities with those podcasters. That will be the biggest spike you'll see. So thanks for the question, Jake. Sean asked, do you have any suggestions for guest management and how to keep consistent time-wise? Sean is in a case where he's really struggled with consistency recently, especially after some issues in family, good issues like having a baby and just struggling with the consistency there. And in podcasting, we talk often about the importance of consistency. It is one of the most important ways to grow an audience and to build a following is when you can be consistent. Just think about your relationship with your spouse. If you were inconsistent in your expressions of love, your relationship wouldn't last. Or think about friendships. If you weren't consistently staying in touch with each other, your relationships wouldn't last. I had some of my best friends at my former full-time job, but since leaving that job, I haven't maintained consistent contact with those friends, and thus we don't really know each other anymore, or we haven't seen each other in months. It's because there was no consistency. The same thing can happen with your podcast audience. If you are not consistent, then they can struggle to build that relationship with you. You can struggle to build an audience. And not to mention the fact that, well, I am mentioning it, but when you look at your audience and your episodes after a year, if you've not been consistent, you might look back and see that, oh, in 2 years, I released only 9 episodes. That was me. In my first 2 years of podcasting, I was completely inconsistent. Not even an episode per month, let alone an episode every 2 months or more frequently. So to your question, Sean, the best way to stay consistent is you have to schedule it. You have to make some kind of appointments with yourself or know that on a particular time at a particular day, you will work on your podcast. When you have family responsibilities, that does mean that maybe your time to do things on the podcast are significantly cut back. So look for how you can spread things out. Maybe on day 1, you record, or you prepare rather. On day 2, you record. On day 3, you edit. On day 4, you publish. On day 5, you promote. Now, those days could be separated by many days. They don't have to be consecutive days in the week. It could be day 1 is on week 1, day 2 and day 3 are in week 2, day 4 and 5 are in week 3 and such. But the important thing is that you know on this particular time, I'm going to be working on my podcast. And you have to honor that commitment with yourself. Communicate that with your family, set things up so that that appointment can be honored. And it's a lot easier to honor those appointments when they're consistent. So if you know every Monday night, I'm unavailable from this hour to this hour because I'm working on my podcast, then that's easy for people to adjust to. And it's easy for you to adjust to as well. Now, that doesn't mean that you can always fit your guest recording schedule into that. So for managing your guests, what I recommend is look at First of all, how can you make it simple for them? What kind of schedule can you keep or offer that makes it easy to work with them? And there might be times when you need to look at using business hours. Now, that doesn't mean you should be moonlighting at your company, but you could look at possibly taking a lunch break, and that's when you record. Maybe it's an early lunch break, late lunch break, something like that. Or you work out with your boss, maybe that you'll work through lunch if you can have an hour early off or come in an hour later, something like that. There may be certain ways that you might be able to be a little flexible with that. The audio quality may not be the best in such circumstances, but it's better to record the good content and have decent audio quality than have studio audio quality and never get your content recorded. So when you're working with your guests, try and schedule it that works with them. And to help you with that, because you asked about guest management, it could be as simple as a spreadsheet or a calendar where you put in there the name of the guest, some of your notes about them, and the time that you'll be recording. You could also use scheduling tools like Calendly, Appointlet, Schedule Once, Time Trade, tools like that. You could also set them up on some kind of email sequence, whether that be with Boomerang for Gmail or an email newsletter system, but you have to be careful with those because of opt-in regulations and such. Most importantly, or probably most attainable, is maybe even lowering your standards or expectations a little bit. That doesn't mean you have to record in low quality or record never, but maybe instead of doing an hour-long episode, try and keep it shorter. Shorter is not necessarily better, but one thing for sure is shorter is often easier to do because it means less time. There's less to edit. There's less to record. And you can get better when you try to be shorter. So those are some ideas for you to manage guests as well as try and stay consistent. Most of all, you have to find what works for you. And maybe recording with guests doesn't work anymore. In the chat room, Brad Hargis asked, how can you stay consistent when you have co-hosts? Same thing there. You have to schedule it or come to some agreement that on this time, on this night, or on this day every week is when we're going to record, or every 2 weeks, or whatever your recording schedule is. Like one of my co-hosts actually has set with his job that he has a certain time that he's unavailable for his job. And that certain time is when we record our podcasts. That's his marked unavailability. So he's never booked or almost never booked for work at that time so that he can be part of the podcast. Since we know, and it's easy for him to do that because the podcast is recorded at a consistent time on a consistent day. So while the burden of maintaining consistency is really on me, or for you as the host of your own podcast, the burden of that consistency is on you. The more you can be consistent as the leader, the better you can help others to be consistent as well. Jason asked with this question, he said, I bought the Lavalier BY-M1 microphone and am currently recording on my Android smartphone. I would like to record cell phone calls, but am unable to hear anything when my lav mic is plugged in. I need a headphone splitter that can plug into my smartphone. I was wondering if you had any suggestions. And Jason is from Canada, so the suggestions would be leaning toward Canada. But while I'm about to recommend some of the products will work, you can shop for them on Amazon.com or Amazon.ca. Prices will vary. The first thing you might be thinking of, if you've followed me for a while, is a TRRS splitter. TRRS stands for tip, ring, sleeve. If you look at the plug on one of these, it would be a 3.5 millimeter plug most likely, and you would see 3 black stripes, or they might be white in some cases. Whereas stereo, you normally see 2 stripes on it, a TRS, and mono, you would see only 1 stripe. So a TRRS is designed to connect to headset type plugs, which you commonly find on smartphones, tablets, some laptop computers even, where it's a single plug that does both input and output. So a TRRS splitter would split that out so you could plug the microphone into one plug and the headphones into another plug. However, This microphone that you're using, the BY-M1, is already a TRRS microphone designed for use on mobile devices. So it might not work on a splitter because it's already being split and routed in a particular way. So you could work with some other adapters, like Rode makes an adapter that goes from TRRS to TRS, and then you use a splitting adapter like this, or maybe consider replacing the microphone. And that's a very reasonable thing when you look at how many adapters or the complications and potential things that could go wrong with trying to string together multiple adapters and switching things around. So what I recommend in this particular case is the IK Multimedia iRig Mic Lav. And this is a lavalier microphone that would have a TRRS plug, so it can plug into the analog port on a smartphone or a mobile device, Android or iOS if you have the little adapter. And on the end of this, there's the lav mic, which is a pretty good lav mic. And there's this little splitter built into it where you can plug your headphones right there into it, and a little switch to say whether you're plugging in headphones or plugging in another microphone. This would allow you to then speak through that lav microphone and hear your guest through your headphones. Because if you plug in anything else, like you've already found, what's happening when you plug in that microphone only that you have right now is that it's capturing both the input and the output from your phone. So you could go the splitter and multiple adapter route or replace your microphone. And this IK Multimedia iRig Mic Lav is pretty good too. And I would guess maybe even better than the microphone that you're using. Though these low-cost lavalier microphones, quality of them does range significantly. Over in the chat room, Mike Wilkerson said, was intrigued to see / intake your recent Don't Focus on Your Numbers episode. My question is, every opportunity across multiple podcasts that we've been fortunate enough to monetize, numbers, listenership, and the regular radio-style detail have always been the first questions. Your suggestions on how to answer while at the same time segueing into value commentary in a discussion? So what we have in podcasting frequently is CPM, cost per 1,000 downloads per episode, not per month at all. I've done an episode recently on why downloads per month is really a meaningless statistic. But with these downloads per episode, many sponsors are looking for impressive numbers, like in the thousands of range. However, if it's someone that's not familiar with internet advertising or they're a smaller company, they might be happy with a smaller number. And that's what you will often see, is that the more niche sponsor and the more relevant they are, the more they already recognize the value in being in a podcast that reaches to their ideal audience. So you have to shift that conversation more toward the value of the audience and not so much the numbers. So they may start by saying, okay, how many downloads do you receive? And you could first answer, let me put it this way. One way you could do it, not the best way, is you could simply say, I get 100 downloads per episode, but blah, 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 blah. That's not the best way to segue into it. Better way would be to say, our audience, let me back this up, to say, we have 100 people downloading our podcast. All of them are completely interested in this type of product and type of service, this type of topic that we discuss, that your product is a good fit for. So see, you can mention the number, but very quickly shift it over to the relevance with the audience, not that mere number. And every time it comes back to the number, you could use terms like highly targeted or 100% relevant or engaged audience, that kind of thing. So it's not merely 100 people, but it's 100 of your ideal customers, that kind of thing. And still, in your own selling of your podcast, make sure that you are being reasonable in what you're asking from your audience or from your podcast sponsors, and that you're not trying to soak them for everything they're worth. Gary Riemann said, I know you're not a SoundCloud fan, hence this question. My new podcast is hosted on both Podbean and SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, and etc. all link to my Podbean feed. However, my website uses the SoundCloud embedded player and offers 5 different options for subscriptions. I'm promoting both the website /SoundCloud and Podbean /iTunes /player.fm /Stitcher on social media. Pros and cons of this approach in terms of growing my audience. Mostly cons, unfortunately. It's splitting your audience heavily. First of all, going to the fact that you're hosting on both SoundCloud and Podbean. Hosting on SoundCloud is really a waste. Even if they're your only podcast host, they deserve to be thrown under the bus. They don't support podcasters, basically. They have something that's very rudimentary, doesn't give you all the features you need, doesn't have very good stats, doesn't filter out bots and spam and stuff. But you're already hosting on Podbean, and your feed is coming from Podbean. Podbean gives you the options you need. They give you the controls that SoundCloud doesn't give you, or don't give you. The stuff like the new iTunes tags, stuff like search engine optimization abilities in your feed. You can have that with Podbean as well as Libsyn, Blueberry, and some of these others. You can't do that with SoundCloud. So I really recommend just get off SoundCloud. There's no good reason to be on SoundCloud. Now, if you're seeing, you're getting a bunch of plays from SoundCloud, it's probably because you're embedding the SoundCloud player on your website. Now, it's usually the podcasters who like the SoundCloud player, not necessarily the podcast fans. So most likely, I'm guessing, the reason you're using the SoundCloud player on your site is because you think it looks prettier. Well, look at the options that Podbean provides as well. Theirs are pretty good, and you could also use your own embedded player of any sort that hosts from your Podbean feed. Because right now, by having your SoundCloud player on your website and your RSS feed from Podbean, your stats are going in 2 different places. And you can't really trust the stats from SoundCloud. And when you said that you're promoting all of these different things and the different players, I really recommend you promote very few things. Your website being the most important thing. And on your website, it makes it obvious where you can subscribe in podcast apps and such, as well as your episodes are playable on your website. And every now and then you could promote specific subscription options. But the most specific I suggest you get, because there are hundreds of podcast apps out there, I suggest Apple Podcasts, subscribe on Android.com. You give it your RSS feed URL. It gives you a link back that allows people to, well, as the name implies, subscribe on Android. And you could every now and then maybe promote some other place, but really those 2 are going to be your top ones. Your website first, really. But then for podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, and subscribe on Android.com. And you could promote those separately and more targeted. So you could say, have got an iOS device or got an iPhone, subscribe to our app in Apple Podcasts. There's the link. Later, you could say, have an Android phone, subscribe to our podcast in your favorite Android podcast app, and you give them the subscribe on Android.com link that works for the most popular Android subscription options. That would be better than promoting a whole bunch of things like player.fm. There's, as good as a player as it might be, there's not really a need to promote how people can subscribe through that one specific player, or Overcast or Instacast or Downcast or any of these other podcast apps. Promoting your SoundCloud link, don't do it at all, really. Promoting your Podbean link, again, don't do it. Promote your website, and your website can link to these separate podcast apps as well. Thanks for the question, Gary. Marissa Callie in the chat said, so you're saying Podbean is the way to go when you're starting out? No, not really. It depends on your particular needs. Podbean is in my list of recommendations, but they're at the bottom of my list. They've significantly improved over the years. There's still just a couple things missing or not quite the way I'd like to see them, but they are very good. And if you want to sign up at Podbean, then you can use the promo code Noodle. Libsyn is also very good. Blueberry, also very good. And the same promo code Noodle will give you a free month with any of those 3 companies, and that is my affiliate code. Podbean is probably the least expensive option of all of them for starting out. So if you really have to think about the dollars you spend, yeah, go with Podbean. If you're on a WordPress website, go with Blueberry. If you are wanting to make a basic podcast website that you could also have your mobile apps, own standalone mobile apps for, then consider going with Libsyn. Podbean is really good for running a Patreon-like campaign right there inside of Podbean. With all 3 of these companies, you can even, if you're using their hosting service, you can even map your own domain to them. So instead of it being like myawesomepodcast.podbean.com, it could be myawesomepodcast.com. And that could work for Blueberry, for Libsyn, for Podbean, not for a whole lot of other companies, though. So if you're just starting out, Podbean is one of my recommendations, really depending on your needs. And again, that promo code Noodle works with Libsyn, Blueberry, Spreaker, and Podbean, and gives you a free month with any of them. Jeanette Jackson asked, do the majority of podcasters make money from podcasting, or is the intent just to share their thoughts about a subject they are passionate about? I think the majority of podcasters out there are simply passionate about this. Certainly the majority of them started simply passionate and not with the intention of making money. Podcasting is so much of a ground roots thing. It was created by individuals, not by corporations, but individuals who wanted a way to share a message and enable other people to share messages with the world. And most of the podcasts that you see out there are people passionate about this, not making money and maybe not even intending to make money. Someday they may, but most of them are simply passionate. You have to be passionate about this. Now, the major corporations jumping into podcasting and that get a lot of attention on their podcasts, they're really only the 1% of podcasts. They aren't as flexible or as agile as you can be with your podcast. You can implement a change really quickly. You can incorporate your audience feedback really quickly. You can develop relationships with your audience. The big corporations jumping into podcasting can't really do that. So I do think the majority of podcasters are doing this because they're passionate about it, not because they're trying to make money. Michael Delaney asked, should you have a show on Libsyn and Podbean? No, I don't think so, because these are simply media hosts. You don't need multiple media hosts. You only need one to host your media, and you could use them to create your RSS feed, or you could use your own website with PowerPress to create your own RSS feed. You don't have to host on Libsyn, Podbean, Blueberry, Spreaker, and all of these other hosting companies. Just simply host on one and build your own platform. And the host, the media host, is a tool to help you build your own platform. Whereas SoundCloud really wants you to build their platform. But these other places are interested in helping you build your platform. Marissa also asked, I'm on Squarespace and plan to have each podcast episode on my site. Do you know what works with them? You can use any podcast media host with Squarespace. If you're using Squarespace to create your RSS feed, you are quite limited on the features that you can incorporate in your feed, some of the SEO features. I don't think they even support the new iTunes tags for seasons, episode numbers, episode titles, and some of that. But you could create your RSS feed with Libsyn, Blueberry, Spreaker, Podbean, any of them, and then simply embed those episodes on your site, on your Squarespace site, because you could link to it on Squarespace. They have a special spot where you can put in a link to an audio file, or you could maybe embed the player on your site. And each of these companies can provide some embed code that will work on your own website or most other website services out there. Daryl asked, what's the big deal with Spotify? Why is every podcaster now trying to get their show on Spotify? Spotify is big at least for music consumption. They're bigger than Apple Music. They're closing in on Pandora. So the appeal is here's this listening platform that already has a bunch of people on it, and podcasts could potentially get in front of that big audience as well. But as Rob Greenling points out, traditionally, music platforms have not done well with mixing podcasts onto their platforms. Now, iTunes is separate because in 2005, when Apple launched podcast support, iTunes was already a media consumption platform. You could get music, audiobooks, around that same time, movies and TV shows. So it became, it's a store, it's a whole store, a catalog of all kinds of content. It's not only a music listening platform. And even back then, really, iTunes was not a music listening platform like the iTunes store. It was a music purchasing platform. They didn't have Apple Music back then where you could listen to music from inside iTunes that you subscribe to and you can listen to for free. You would have to buy music, and then the iTunes desktop software would help you manage that. And that was very similar to the other things. You would buy or rent movies, TV shows. You would download podcasts, download books, audiobooks, and such. So it was really a whole media consumption platform, whereas Spotify is a music platform. Pandora, music platform. That's not to say some podcasts will have no audience there. I think that if you can get into Spotify, that's good to do. And there are multiple ways you can get in. There is an actual form that Spotify has that you can submit your podcast to them, regardless of who your media host is. You can, if you use the Libsyn RSS feed, you can also submit your podcast through Libsyn. Or if you use anyone else for your RSS feed, you can submit directly to Spotify through their own form, which is basically a Google form, surprisingly unbranded for them. And this is the next coolest thing. And that's why many podcasters want to be in there. Plus, there's that potential that it could simplify for some of the audience members who are already listening in Spotify, and then they see in their Spotify subscriptions, however that works out, that they see there's also a new episode of their favorite podcast. It's cool. It's shiny. Is it really going to be a big hit for podcasting? I don't think so. I think the only way we'll get major momentum and attention to podcasts is if Google supports it, because we've already had so much momentum behind this in other small ways as well as big ways. I don't think a Spotify or Pandora supporting podcasts is going to bring a huge wave of podcast subscribers. I think Google has that kind of leverage. Apple has already used that leverage. Google would be next. So if you can get in Spotify, great, but it's not going to make or break your show. Chabi asked, what do you recommend between Libsyn and SoundCloud? He wasn't here earlier, so my answer is anything but SoundCloud. So in this case, since you're saying Libsyn or SoundCloud, I'd say Libsyn. Promo code Noodle, but you could also use Blueberry, or Podbean, or Spreaker even. Promo code Noodle works with all three of them. Stay away from SoundCloud. They're absolutely horrible. They do not really support podcasters. I could end the sentence there. All right, that's it for now. Thank you for the questions that came in live as well as that came in beforehand. Join me again Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live when I do these podcasting Q&As, and you can share your question live during that time, or you can send your question ahead of time through theaudacitytopodcast.com/contact. The next episode of the Audacity Podcast is going to be a nicely controversial one, releasing on November 21st, and it will be why you should not publish audio on YouTube with data in it. It's not only opinion. There's actual data to show this is why you shouldn't do it. Look at what some of these terms of service say that help you understand why you shouldn't be doing this and why it can only hurt your platform, not help it. So watch for that. That'll be episode 332 over at theaudacitypodcast.com. and subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can receive every episode automatically. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity to Podcast.com. Thanks for joining me.